Hi, welcome to First Unitarian.
We gather on Sundays to celebrate life, to witness to truth, and to be with each other in life's challenges and joys.
All week long, we're building a community, one connection and one person at a time. We care for each other and our children, we grow our souls, and we transform our world.
We're glad.
Good morning. Welcome to Sunday morning at First Unitarian Church of Rochester. It is so good to be here with all of you, here in person and online, as we gather to pursue our collective mission. Here at church, our spiritual mission is through spiritual connection in community. We listen deeply to others and ourselves. We open to wonder and transformation, and we serve together with love and humility. I'm the Reverend Sherry Halliday-Kwan. I am the senior minister here, and I am preaching today, but I am by no means the only one leading worship. We have Reverend AJ, with whom I have the pleasure of serving this congregation, and Chris Dorso as our worship associate. We've got Tommy. Rich Wilder is coming in as a special guest on video. Behind the scenes, we've got our tech support people, we've got ushers and greeters here in person and online. It takes a whole team to make Sunday morning happen, and that is true of all of you. It wouldn't be Sunday morning without all of you. We come, those of us here in person, and many of us joining online, on the ancestral land of the Seneca people. And so we acknowledge with respect the Seneca or Onondaga people, the keepers of the Western Door, part of the Haudenosaunee. Here on this land, if you are new, and I mean extremely new to this community, maybe you've been here once or 7 or 8 times, but you're a little nervous and you haven't yet made a connection with others, or maybe you've been coming here for 30 years and you'd like to deepen connection. Well, if you're one of the first two, I invite you to, if you're online, fill out a connection form. If you're here in person, stop by the welcome desk. And If you're one of those who's been here for a long time, I invite you to stick around after the service. In all of these ways, we hope to deepen our connections in community. After the service, folks online are invited, if you're a part of a group of people who identify as white, to join an anti-racism conversation. If you're here in person or online, I invite you to connect with each other, to ask what you thought of the sermon, or simply ask people where they're from and who loved them into being. Every week, but especially this week, we come to church to witness to the truths of each other's lives, and that can bring up a lot. So if you're worried about someone else, or if you're going through a hard time or a transition, there's a chat chaplain available online, and here, just outside in the lobby throughout the service, there'll be a chaplain waiting if you just need someone to connect with during or after the service. That was a lot, I know. But now I'm going to need all of your help, because together we'll begin our sacred time. And here in the sanctuary, Paul Gardella will light our chalice. If you're online and you have a chalice or a candle handy, I invite you to light one wherever you are. I invite all of us to join in our unison words. May the flame we now kindle inspire us to use our power to heal with love, to help with compassion, to bless with joy, and to seek liberation in the fullness of community.
My wife and I dropped our son off yesterday morning at the airport to go on his high school trip to Greece. Like real Greece, not Greece. I mean, I know the sign says airport Greece. Turns out there's a whole separate Greece. Entirely different. So this week, we went through my own photo albums from when I went on my own high school trip to Greece years ago. And just to see if there were any photos that I took back then that he could maybe recreate. In the 1990s, fashion was different, very, very different. And in fact, in Greece, I was wearing a bright green, very garish Boston Celtics starter jacket. And my wife laughed, and she said, "Good thing I canceled that 25 years ago." And I said, "Did you? Did you really?" She's watching this at home, cringing right now. And isn't that why we come to church? Because the things that are relics from our past help us make new connections in the present, and whether our wives want them to or not. And sometimes those connections can be really vibrant and really real. And sometimes, even though the jersey from high school still fits, we watch our kids and our grandkids take off and experience the world in their own ways. And we take those pieces from our past selves, and we're still those people. But we work together in community to be newer, better, and hopefully more fashion-conscious versions of ourselves.
like to share, and the mic does help, I'd like to share one of my favorite stories from the Hebrew Bible. It's from the book of Esther, and it is about, not surprisingly, Esther. But it begins with Vashti. It begins with another woman, the queen. Vashti is the queen in about 500 BC in Persia, and she is married, as is often the case, to the king, Xerxes. And as is often the case, Xerxes gets drunk with his friends and summons his wife to appear before them. But she doesn't want to, and so she doesn't. The king, not being accustomed to being disobeyed or questioned, banishes his wife, the queen. Vashti knows what the consequences are of saying no, but rejecting the ability of another to determine what she does with her own body, she allows herself to be banished, choosing that over being summoned. So the king needs a new wife, and he summons all the beautiful women to come before him. A man named Mordecai sends his niece, Esther. She is very beautiful. And Mordecai and Esther are also Jewish, which in Persia is a marginalized and oppressed community. He sends Esther, but tells her not to mention that she's Jewish. There's no way she would be selected if she were open about this. And she does as she's told and appears before the king and is selected, chosen as the most beautiful, the most lovely of all the potential wives. That's not the end, though. It never is, even in all the happily ever afters that begin somewhat differently than this story. Esther and Xerxes have, as much as is reasonable in 500 BC, a happy marriage. Mordecai, though, continues to be an openly marginalized and oppressed person in an empire where his existence and customs and community are not permissible. And an advisor to the king, Haman. We're a little early on Purim for those who know this story, but it is true, and I appreciate the breaking in of the congregation into the telling. Haman is a bit of a bore, not in a muted, boring sense, but in a bullying, awful sense. Haman decides that all must bow to him. As an advisor to the king, he is worth all the glorification, at least from those that the king doesn't know about, those outside the walls of the city, as Mordecai is. But as a Jewish person, Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, and that infuriates him. This goes on for a bit, and eventually Haman decides that Mordecai must die. And not only Haman, but all the Jewish people in this community. Haman is, again, a bit of a bore. Now, there is, of course, a Jewish queen in the palace, but one who has pretended to not be Jewish for all this time. When news of this potential attack, this potential genocide, spreads to Mordecai, Mordecai talks to his niece, talks to Esther, and says, "You know that this is not right. You know that the Jewish people have not only been faithful to our own ways, but also to that of the king. I myself, Mordecai, I have saved the king from assassination previously, and also, well, this happy marriage This too is part of what we have done together. But Esther knows that coming before the king when not being summoned is even worse than not coming when being summoned. Instead of banishment, it's execution herself that she faces, not a fate that anyone would choose. And Mordecai gives her a clear choice. Esther, it is fine if you do nothing. The Jewish people, we will find a way. But if you do not do this, who will you be? Dishonor and death will come to you in some way, to your family in some way. Sure, you have safety now as the queen, but you are Jewish. And perhaps you have become queen. Perhaps you have been placed into the palace for such a time as this. Who knows? So Esther goes to the king, but she doesn't say all that needs to be said immediately. She doesn't say, don't kill the Jewish people, because that would be heinous, and by the way, Haman is a bore. She doesn't lead with that. She invites him to a feast. She takes a page out of Anne Perry, the Minister of Food, here at this congregation's playbook, and she invites the king to a feast, where she tells him, hey, by the way, you were going to be assassinated, but Mordecai saved your life. And then she does it again and invites him to another feast and says, hey, by the way, your boy Haman, he's a bore, and he's planning to kill all the Jewish people. Esther saves the Jewish people in this story. But it's never just about Esther. It's about Esther and Xerxes and Mordecai and Vashti. There are many roles in this story. But Haman is still a bore.
When we gather together in worship, we make holy space. With our words, our presence, and even through the power of silence, we create a context for transformation, for community, for healing. Time set aside for silence, for simple breathing, is a gift that we can give one another and ourselves, inviting our hearts and souls the space to come forth and be present with one another and with the whole world of being and meaning. Please join me now in co-creating a sacred time and space of silence. Thank you for sharing these breaths with me. And I invite you now into the spirit of meditation, prayer, and reflection. Great mystery which grounds us and surrounds us, divine presence known by many names and in many ways. Help us find a center amid the uncertainty. Each day, as we navigate the tasks of life, the duties, the surprises, and the unexpected joys of life, may we find moments to lift our gaze from this and the next, to offer thanks for all that came before us and made that which is good possible, to recognize and affirm how we have grown in spirit, in heart, in wisdom, to grieve for all we have lost and all that could have been. Help us to find a center amid the uncertainty, a thread to hold on to when the storm swirls about us. Spirit of life, hear this simplest prayer, that there may be peace in our world. But knowing that while our prayer may be simple, the world is not. And so we pray too that there be justice, without which there can be no peace. May all beings have the freedom of self-determination. May all governments the world over fulfill their obligations to protect their people and the prosperity of the land, rather than raging war and bringing about even more needless suffering and death to a hurting world. May the people the world over have privacy, agency, security, protected and not abused by those in power. May we celebrate each small win for justice and equity, each moment of that protection, no matter how small, to keep our souls sustained and fortified for the long road of progress ahead yet to travel. As we grieve each setback, each loss of life, each a reminder that not all lives matter the same in our society, our decidedly unwell, unequal society. Spirit of love, help us find a center amid the uncertainty, a thread to hold on to when the storm swirls about us, a compassion in our hearts for each and every being on our shared world, this pale blue dot, a compassion centered in the love larger than any one of us. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. In spiritual community, all of who we are is welcome into the circle. And so we bear witness to the grief, the growth, and the gratitude that we each experience. Wherever your life has taken you this week, or even just this morning, know that you do not journey alone. Whether you join this community every week, or if we are a way station this morning on a continuing pilgrimage, know that this is a holy space for rest and for witness. If you're online, I invite you now to type into the chat that which is most present on your heart this morning. And if you're in the sanctuary, I invite you to the altars in the aisles to lift a stone and place it into the bowl of water, feeling its weight, the weight of your grief or growth and or gratitude, and then releasing that weight to be held in the waters of community. Let us now share in this ritual of community care. for all that we bring in our hearts this morning, for all we lay down in community care. May our care for each other be a center amid the uncertainty, a witness of the larger love that holds us all. Amen. Blessed be.
This week we share the plate collection with Justice for Migrant Families. Justice for Migrant Families provides support to individuals in the federal detention facility in Batavia, information and resources to families in our community, and advocacy both within and beyond our local community. You can give online at rochesterunitarian.org/donate, or by Venmo, or here in person in our offering boxes. Our offering will now be received with gratitude.
This is the song for baby perch. Oh, I will never know you. And at the back of what we've done, there is the knowledge of you. And I wish we could take every path, could spend 100 years adoring you. Yes, I wish we could take every path, because I hated to close the door on you. When it was dark, I called and you came. When it was dark, I saw shapes. When I see stars, I feel in your hand. And I see stars, and I reel again. Well, mercy me, I'll be goddamned. It's been a long, long time since I last saw you. And I have never known the plan. It's been a long, long time. How are you? Your eyes are green, your hair is gold, your hair is black, your eyes are blue. I closed the rings and I doubled back, but you know I hated to close the doggone door on you. We take a walk along the dirty lake. Who's cussing at me over her eggs? Poor little cousin, I don't want your dress.
Sometimes there are those sermons where for 15 or 20 minutes you wonder how the songs and the story and those words are all going to come together. And then at the very end, it all just gets wrapped up with a pretty little bow. That's not this sermon. In the context of rising fascism, emboldened misogyny, a crumbling democracy, and climate crisis, I'm not feeling the luxury of time right now. So let's get down to brass tacks. This is about abortion. It's about me, about you, about them, about all of us. It's about why we care and how to care more thoughtfully and lovingly and in accordance with our deepest values. And it's also deeply personal. And so I just want to repeat some of what I said earlier during the welcome, that if you're going through a hard time or a time of transition, or you're worried about someone else, our chat chaplain and our chaplain here are available to you. And if this sermon and this gathering and our ways of being together bring up for you experiences of your past, or ways in which you could use support and care, you have those resources and your ministers, both me and Reverend AJ, and also what began as a ministry of this church and is now available and sits outside of, but connected to our legacy, an after-abortion talk hotline, Connect and Breathe. Their website is connectandbreathe.org, and their phone number is 866-647-1764. It's not one of those sermons where everything gets tied up neatly with a bow. And I'm mad about it because I was hoping I'd never have to do it. This history here in this congregation is one of more than a century of supporting women's rights and reproductive health. From Newton Mann to Dick Gilbert to my immediate past predecessor, Karen Anderson, this congregation has in many ways and at many times supported people's right to access abortion. And I'm calling ministers by name here to tell the story of this congregation because they're often the most visible, but let's make no mistake about it. It's the work of this congregation and the people within it, people whose names are lost to the historical record, but whose work leaves traces and tastes of liberation. It's been woven into the life and the commitments of this congregation for generations. And so I'd hoped we'd be done. I'd hoped that both societally and congregationally, our attention to reproductive justice, and in particular, access to abortion, would no longer be warranted. Like all who work for justice, the existence of injustice, well, it's a reason for being. And I'm activated by that. I come alive by that. But like all who work for justice, I work toward being out of a job. And this was one that I was grateful had been done before I arrived, and so I wouldn't have to worry about it. But that's not the case. My reasons, though, for hoping that access to abortion would no longer be a galvanizing issue were not simply lofty and noble or strategic and well analyzed. My exposure to the topic was centered on a woman's right to choose, legal rights, access to health care that had to do with being filtered through the lens of middle and upper class white women. Around the time I was in high school and was deeply acquainted with the lived experience of people who crossed the border. I grew up in California with people who crossed the border into Mexico to access abortion because of cost and not legal right. Around the time that this was a reality I was intimately acquainted with, I still held up an illusion that the fight was over, that the struggle was gone, that legal access was all there was to talk about. Simply like dental care, it was cheaper in Mexico. I hadn't updated an intellectual or activist framework to include the experience of my closest friends and family. I so wanted it to be different. Around this same time, others were developing a new framework for reproductive justice. The legal right at the time seeming fairly secure, a romantic idea now. Others, and in particular Black women in this country, were calling for a framework of reproductive justice centered around the right to have children, the right to not have children, bodily autonomy, and the right to bear children in a safe and healthy environment that was societally supported. Around this time, when I was hoping that the struggle was over, others, like Sister Song and many organizations across the US and globally, were saying, no, there's more to this. Looking at the whole picture, the Reverend Shelley Page takes the lessons of Sister Song and offers them to us as holy yeses. It wasn't simply about saying yes to abortion, but also yes to full and affordable, real access to sexuality education, birth control, and abortion. Yes to protection for women and people of all gender against sexual assault and abuse. Yes to infertility treatment for all who desire to have children. Yes to full and affordable access to prenatal and postnatal care. Yes to real support for adoption and motherhood. Yes to good childcare, a living wage, a society that could support wanted children. Yes to safe and healthy neighborhoods in which to raise these precious children. Yes to good quality education and health care for each and every child. Yes to all of these things that are intimately related to our reproductive lives, truly wanting them for all peoples, regardless of how much money they make, where in the country they live, the color of their skin, whether they are civilian or military, whether they are undocumented or citizens. Yes, yes, yes. The Reverend Shelley Page reminds us through the lessons of those who work to expand women's rights and reproductive health into a framework of reproductive justice, that truly our interdependence is not limited only to what is legal, but to what is possible and what is supported. We mean this not only in societal, structural ways, but also too through the lens of what it means to speak to the human condition. A yes to be free of stigma and shame. Just as marriage equality for same-sex couples didn't mean that the fight for LGBTQ activism was over, 50 years of Roe v. Wade never meant that the end of the fight was real. But I didn't want that to be true, because I had personal hang-ups also. Doubt. Partnered with a woman and with no plans to parent, Who was I to talk about accidental or unwanted pregnancy, since that was unlikely to happen? Never mind that sexual and gender minorities are more likely to need access to abortion because of rape or assault. Who was I as someone who had no plans to parent to talk about mandatory motherhood? Who was I to talk about something that was wildly complicated? Something that elicited a broad range of feelings, of process. Who was I who grew up in a context where abortion was considered the obvious choice if it got in the way of career or plans, and yet who journeyed with friends who found it wasn't so simple after all? Abortion, like so many other issues in which humans participate in, is complicated. And I would so very much have liked to have never had to speak on it, never had to be involved, never had to take up the framework of reproductive justice and call us into a deeper way of supporting parents and those who chose not to parent. But here it comes crashing around us. Here, in a time like this, it cannot be ignored. It is not only my better angels who call me to listen to the stories of people not represented or counted or advocated for through the lens of a feminism that centers middle and upper class white women. Not only that, but also a reality that suddenly seems much more urgent and much scarier. A reality in which the freedoms and victories of times past are increasingly fragile or simply already eroded. This past week, I spent time with the senior ministers of large UU congregations, people who theoretically have it spiritually all figured out. But we know that's not the case. This week, I spent time with people brought to their knees with the grief of all that had been lost. Right now in Texas, those who are pregnant, and I say those because of course it is not only women, those assigned female at birth who may identify as other genders, who are other genders and yet still can become accidentally pregnant, those who find themselves pregnant and do not wish to be, have approximately 1 week after when they might have expected their menstrual cycle to begin to figure out that they are pregnant and receive legal access to an abortion. If Roe v. Wade falls, 1 week will be all that people have to figure it out. This congregation has a history of chartering buses to protests. I remembered with great fondness the joy with which many of you told me about boarding a bus to participate in the Women's March in January of 2017. And in January of 2022, our sibling UU congregations are chartering buses to transport people across state lines so they might access abortion. I do not feel like we have the luxury of time. Our siblings in Ohio, just hours away from us, are likely to see a similar 6-week ban go into effect if Roe v. Wade is either undone entirely or severely limited. I wished that this would not be a thing I would ever have to speak on. I wish that the ethical and personal complications of abortion, the ways in which I have held the hands of people crying with relief and crying with shame and uncertainty and doubt, would need not never be part of my ministry here from the pulpit, simply a part of my ministry in my office or in hospital rooms or with many of you. Because even with all of our investment in comprehensive sexuality education, even with the very best and most reliable forms of birth control, all of us love someone who has had an abortion. Which is to say, if you have had an abortion, you are loved. 1 out of 6 Americans has had or will have in our lifetimes an abortion. The personal stories and pastoral ministry of accompanying people through health decisions was a challenge that I thought I knew and was up for. And indeed it is. But having found ourselves in this moment, where a framework that asks us to support all who wish to bear children, and all who wish to not bear children, and all who wish to have autonomy over their own bodies, and who wish to be supported to parent in a safe and loving and healthy environment, calls us to another and more active way of being. We know that over the past 45 years, the religious right has grown in this country to be a powerful voting bloc. Abortion has long been the central issue for the religious right, but this coalition was not built around this issue. It was built around the right of religious schools to legally maintain segregation. The racial weaving into the issue of abortion is not accidental, and it is not without great harm. The moral and religious voice in this country has long been articulated by those whose values aim to keep people, women in particular, all those who menstruate, oppressed, in boxes. Unitarian Universalism offers us an alternative. Here in our big tent, there's a great diversity of opinion and values, and it is not my goal to be 100% clear, to convince any of you that when faced with an unexpected pregnancy, abortion is the right choice for you. It may be, or it may not be. But as Unitarian Universalists, our faith calls us to take a holistic view at complicated ethical situations in which the right to life means so much more than simply being born. It means access to health care, to good education, to safe housing, to environmental protections. It means access to the ability to maintain autonomy over our own bodies, to express the freedom and the joy and the worth of what it means to be a human here on this plane. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to be a moral and ethical and religious voice that offers an alternative to the shame and the stigma and the guilt that even those who are a part of that powerful voting bloc feel when they seek abortions. Even those who vote, who work, who protest, who commit arson, who assassinate, who perpetuate spiritual and physical harm to those who seek to preserve the right to abortion. Even people who show up again and again at the Brighton town meetings to fight the Planned Parenthood that will be built there. Even they seek abortions. This human experience is a deeply personal one, but one that connects all of us. Those who joyfully parent, those who want nothing more than to be a parent and who struggle with infertility, those who have had an abortion, and those who did not. This time, this moment, it calls to all of us to listen to the voices of those who have personal experience, to find ways as a congregation, as a community, to return to the legacy of our past, to return to the justice-seeking history of this congregation, and to refresh it, to imbue it with a new way of being, a more holistic, a more loving, a more inclusive framework. I invite all of you as individuals, whether reproductive justice will be the social justice issue that activates you or not, to engage in the spiritual practices of listening to the stories of others, to seeking help when you need it, and to strengthening the connections that honor our interdependence. This is not the issue that I would have wanted for us, but perhaps you, like me, have found yourself in the context of empire for such a time as this. Amen, and blessed be.
How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. I invite you to rise now in voice, body, or spirit and join me in singing How Could Anyone by Libby Roderick. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. Let's sing that again. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to yourself. How could anyone ever tell you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul.
I invite you to remain standing and extinguish our chalice with me. Please join me in unison words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. We are together always, whether we recognize those connections or not. May the strings of interdependence hold us all, whether Vashti or Esther. Whatever choice you have made or the choices of the people around you, know that you are loved and that into this palace, into this place and time, perhaps you were placed for such a time as this. Go in peace, go in love. Amen.